So again, if you want to be a state, you have to join the United Nations, because otherwise, well, it's a pretty risky endeavor, especially at that time. And if you want to join the United Nations, well, that comes with strings. So welcome to the UN. The organization was the impetus of Western leaders, and not surprisingly, it had a very strong ideological bent. The UN preamble begins with a promise to save humanity, quote, from the scourge of war, but it quickly goes on to promise to, quote, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. By 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is binding on all parties to the organization, any state who's a member has to sign on to it, made it clear that democracy was the sole road to this human dignity. Democracy is the only way to human dignity. There were also pragmatic considerations in the sort of evolution of this international legitimacy of democracy, which is that democracy was a system based on consent. It's a system based on transparency, fairness, inclusivity. It seemed to be the only real way to ensure the cooperation of such diverse countries. And again, you have this large inflow of countries after World War II, which is when, of course, the United Nations came into being. The UN's goal of providing security would work best if everyone spoke the same language and had the same rules of the game. And the same could be said for prosperity. More regular and multifaceted interstate relations necessitated some common basic understandings. If we're going to have regular trade, then we need some basic understandings of how each other's systems operate. If we're going to regulate the environment, we need to have these basic common understandings. If we're going to regulate things like chemical and biological weapons, etc., etc. It soon became clear that democracy wasn't just for world leaders. It was expected to have a trickle-down effect to countries around the world. In other words, within those countries. Any state that wanted to be in this club had to promise to play by the new rules. And these rules became codified in an International Bill of Rights. The International Bill of Rights is composed of three things: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we just talked about, and the two international covenants: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right here, ICCPR, and I'm trying to make it circle. There we go. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, these documents were really part of a broader Cold War game, but they both emphasized democracy. And so if you take the human rights class, we'll talk about the Cold War game part. Here we'll emphasize the democracy part. In other words, whether we speak today of political rights or economic rights, both groups emanate from this legal framework born in this democracy paradigm that began to take shape immediately after World War II. Over time, democratic legitimacy is strengthened to the degree that few state leaders attack it head on. And this is typical in international relations. Once there's a consensus that emerges, there are very few state leaders who are willing to be the ones to rock the boat. It doesn't mean that we've got a world of democracies, of course, but it means we've got a world where those at the helm have to consistently demonstrate how their behavior, as well as their attitudes, conform to what is acceptable, to the democratic norm. Otherwise, they risk being treated as second-class citizens of the world. They risk being excluded from trade deals. They risk losing out on security pacts and everyday governance at the international level. This notion has evolved that non-democracies should be treated differently than democracies, like that they can't get weapons of mass destruction, for example. And in part, this stems from the democratic peace argument. There's empirical evidence that suggests that democracies do not go to war with each other. There are very few cases where you can find empirically that happening. The problem is that, first of all, you have a small number of cases historically. We didn't have a lot of democracies, so we can't go back very far historically. The further back we go historically, the fewer number of democracies there are. Another problem is that democracies might not go to war with each other, but they do go to war with non-democratic states. And so it's not like they don't go to war, period. Look at the United States, Afghanistan, and Iraq in just a handful of years. And then another big problem is that democratizing states, those states that are moving towards democracy, are actually much more likely to go to war than even non-democracies are. In other words, those are the most unstable. So if a world of democracies is a secure one, a world of democratizing states is the worst option. Better to have a bunch of non-democracies. Still, this is something that political leaders grabbed and they ran with in the 1990s as communism fell. And some argue that the notion of democratic legitimacy has emerged precisely because the international community wants to benefit from this democratic peace, from this empirical finding. It's seen as an international right to have a world filled with democracies, because then we'll all be better off. So how do democracies do their work? Now that we have this duty of international society to instill certain standards of domestic political order, how do we actually bring democracy there? So we'll discuss the details and the pros and cons of some of these strategies later in the class, but we'll start here with a general overview. Democratizing states use direct and indirect pressures to ensure democracy is equated with legitimacy. You need to be a democracy to have rightful membership and full membership in a number of organizations, from the United Nations to organizations that exist outside of them, regional organizations, including the European Union, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. The carrot of full membership, thanks to democracy, gives you legitimacy. And this legitimacy is at the top, right? You're legitimate as a state leader, but it also, what we call, reverberates. It reverberates down to the domestic scene, because you can show everybody that you are this leader who's respected around the world, who's seen as legitimate around the world, and therefore your own people should also see you as legitimate. Southern and then Eastern Europe were lured by membership into this prosperous, not then as in then, but I really messed up here. Sorry, just ignore I said anything. Southern and Eastern Europe have been lured by membership into this prosperous bloc known as the European Union. You also got bilateral and multilateral aid that comes about to democracies that certain non-democracies have found themselves ineligible for. There are also, of course, sticks of non-membership, illegitimacy, right? And here we have quiet versus loud diplomacy. Isolation. Diplomatic isolation, and I suppose this is better where quiet versus loud diplomacy fits in. The U.S. will stand up and they will castigate you on the world stage. And in fact, there are plenty of other countries that will do it. Many other countries will continue to whisper to you that you're not doing a very good job and that impacts on relations. So there's this diplomatic pressure. There are also economic sanctions, and we can talk about literally sanctions, or we could talk about other economic carrots, not being allowed into a club, not getting preferential treatment for trade deals. Again, generally speaking, the Europeans tend to be more conservative, more patient, more quiet, in part because they lack power, and in part because they had to pursue democracy piecemeal themselves, at home and then abroad. The U.S. tends to be much more aggressive, and you even have occasional military interventions, usually led by the U.S. Are these military interventions always good? Definitely not. But they are. Are they always about democracy, despite what they say? Also not. But sometimes they really are. And sometimes they're necessary, depending on who you ask. Okay, so there are also lots of indirect pressures for democracy. International socialization, propelling this idea that democracy is a right for all people. It's a right for all people to have a democratic system. And this starts at the top in international structures, where you've got transparency, majority votes, and all these sorts of democratic processes that occur, for example, in the United Nations, in the OSCE, in all these institutions. And then there's a hope that people from non-democracies are going to buy into this, that it's going to trickle down. There's also what we call the internationalizing impact of development, where domestic societies see a need for democracy in order to benefit from good trade deals, from cultural exchanges, and all these things. I remember in South Africa, one of the big things that led to significant internal opposition to the apartheid regime by whites who benefited from the apartheid regime was precisely these cultural exchanges that they were locked out of. People would complain that, for example, Sting wouldn't come to their country, and that was something that they really wanted to happen. And so they put up pressure. We'll call it the Sting effect, because that sounds good. Also, civil society support, and this is something we'll talk about ad nauseum because it's so important. And political party support goes in here as well. The use of what we call fraternal parties, which is more relevant to European parties that have a strong and coherent ideology and platform and tend to pursue their brethren parties in non-democracies. So, for example, the Green Party in Germany will create an alliance with the Green Party in a place like Uzbekistan. They don't have one there, but some other non-democracy or illiberal democracy, competitive authoritarian regime where the Green Party exists. And they'll strengthen that Green Party by providing it various material and technical assistance. So, all these pressures rarely go off without resistance, and here are some typical ways that dictators seek to maintain power. The first one is to try to differentiate between political and economic rights, and I referred to this as a false dichotomy before to a certain degree. But democracy-promoting states, especially during the Cold War, equated non-democracy with anti-capitalism and focused largely on abstract freedoms, as opposed to economic security, which was provided by communist regimes to a certain degree. You had the rising Asian tigers in the 1980s, who say really what you hear a lot of today, which is that we need economic development before we can afford democracy. These were countries like Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. And these are standard arguments that go about today. And in fact, when you look at Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, all of those have adopted much stronger democracies since the 1980s. Over the course of the late 1980s, 1990s, you saw democracy sort of democratic consolidation in much of the Asian world, or much of where the Asian tigers were. But a standard argument today is we can't afford political rights. First, we need economic security. Okay? Another standard argument is that those opponents of the incumbent regime who are being supported by Westerners are not true Democrats. Think about Assad in Syria. He calls them terrorists. And in fact, some appear to be terrorists. Some aren't fighting for democracy. They're fighting for something else. Often, pro-democracy forces, whether incumbents or competing political elites, seek international support, but they don't necessarily envision democracy the same way. Or at least they're willing to compromise it in ways that advantage them personally. So, for example, they'll talk about democracy, but then on the ground, they'll only have very symbolic democratic institutions. So they'll have occasional votes and that sort of thing, but they won't allow for strong civil societies. And the third argument here is the stability argument. And there's a long history of authoritarians who have adopted a liberal appearance, these facade democracies, often saying that moving too fast would be destabilizing. We need stability. Moving too fast towards democracy can lead to social destabilization. Political and economic structures would fall apart. Democracy could open up opportunities for social schisms and fights over power, for instance, that could literally fracture the state and break it in part. And indeed, the empirical evidence, as I mentioned before, indicates that war is much more likely when you're moving from a democracy, or when you're moving towards a democracy, than when you're moving towards a non-democracy. In other words, away from democracy. So moving towards democracy tends to be the most risky, and that's the thing that we'll talk about next.